That's lovely. I love that one. With that, Caroline, please unmute yourself and introduce the meeting.
Yes, I'm all set. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our virtual meeting today. We have had speakers doing their presentations virtually since last March, when we could no longer have in-person meetings at the community center. I would like to take this opportunity to thank both Martin Boucher, our Vice President and our Zoom coordinator, and Ann Parsons, our speaker chair, for making these meetings possible. This is the first time we are having a virtual meeting in the fall season, and we are trying something new. After the Q&A session with our speaker, Dr. Robert Galway, we will be setting aside time in which you can chat with fellow members of our club. You can imagine that you are at the community center having coffee and making conversation at our in-person meetings, except that this will be a virtual chat room. So please remain on the line for about 15 to 20 minutes in order to engage with other members of the club in a different way. And please remind your PROBUS friends to join us. We would really like to get more participation in our virtual meetings, because this is the way it's going to be for a while yet. I hope that you enjoy today's virtual meeting, and please remember to mute your device so that there isn't any extraneous noise. Thank you.
Wonderful. And if you introduce our speaker then, please.
Good afternoon, PROBUS members. As you heard, I'm Ann Parsons with the Speaker's Chair. Our speaker today is Dr. Robert Galway. Robert, or Dr. Bob as he is known to friends, graduated from U of T with a degree in economics and geology. He then returned to U of T and received a degree in medicine, and then became an orthopedic surgeon, practicing at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Montreal and Toronto General Hospital. He conducted medical clinics up north, flying up in his plane to Timmins, Kapuskasing, and Moose Factory. Robert has also been a physician for the national ski team and the Toronto Blue Jays. His presentation is comparing the 1918 pandemic to the COVID-19 pandemic. Lessons learned and forgotten. Welcome, Robert.
All right, Dr. Bob, the floor is all yours.
Good afternoon to my several friends, and a warm hello to new acquaintances in the Beaver Valley PROBUS Club. I am Robert Galway, and it's a pleasure to join you today in what can only be described as challenging circumstances. A brief comment or two before we embark on today's online presentation, which is certainly a first, at least for myself. Firstly, I'm certain that it has escaped notice that the original invitation was going to be on a topic prepared for your member Jeff Lowe's book club group, based on the life and times of the Canadian Arctic explorer and photographer Richard Sterling Finney. However, this has been set aside while we await for more times. At the same time, I became persuaded that today's topic was more suited to the virtual reality situation that faces major segments of society in this COVID and post-COVID-19 environment. The genesis of this project was a combination of curiosity and happen chance. Self-isolation imposed by last spring's outbreak of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic and an unexpected family illness led me to seek distraction through immersion in the history of the last great epidemic that we went through, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918. And this was in an effort to understand whether there are lessons to apply to the present day chaos that surrounds us on a personal and daily basis. And it soon became apparent that this undertaking was a vital illustration of the famous aphorism by the late Yale University philosopher and historian George Santayana, that those that do not know history are condemned to repeat it. And I've added my own corollary to that. For those that do know history, some seek to corrupt it. Now, let me share with you some of the material that I uncovered in this archaeological dig into the history of medicine while I bring up a presentation incorporating what I have learned. It's really appreciative of the opportunity to be with you today. I'm going to modify the title slightly, The Old and the New Pandemic, the Spanish Flu of 1918, and the novel COVID-19 pandemic of 2020. I'm going to start off with a bit of a historical review, most of it derived from the archives of the Toronto Globe. And the first thing to call to your attention is that this was the mother of all pandemics. It presented to the world in 1918, late spring and the fall. It went on for 3 years with 3 waves. It killed 50 million people out of a total infected population of 500 million people. It is an unbelievable event, perhaps unequaled in the world of medicine other than for the bubonic plague. And what was the source of this infection? It was not a COVID virus. In fact, it was a swine virus. The consensus opinion is that it started in a United States military encampment in Fort Riley in Kansas with the arrival of American troops in the Western Front in 1918. However, work from Oxford suggests that it really was an outbreak of influenza, la grippe, in a French military camp receiving UK military soldiers and carried back to the UK. However, in my research, I actually found this article in the Toronto Globe that quotes a missionary returning from the Orient indicating that like today's influenza pandemic due to the COVID virus, there was a Chinese source for this. As what's happened in North America at the outset, the medical profession weren't particularly serious or persuaded that this was a significant issue. Here we have the medical officer of health of the city of Toronto saying it was a respiratory illness caused by the presence of dust. Of interest, Dr. Hastings turned out to be the father of my own professor of public medicine 50 years hence, John Hastings, and perhaps because his father got it wrong, my own professor in my medical school year of 1963 paid very little attention to the pandemic of 1918. And there was a generation, certainly of my age group, that grew up knowing about the Spanish flu, but not having much grasp of the details. Nevertheless, the mayor of Halifax got it right, like the cruise ships of this year. When one of the ships with affected sailors went to land in Halifax in September of 1918, he wouldn't let them ashore. This pandemic is now sweeping through the world, not with the same intensity that the flu did, but the fact of the matter is, here we are in Potter's Field in 1918 with mass burial sites, and here we are on the right in 2020 with steam shovels accomplishing the same thing. I'd like to go back just for a second and address the issue of the title called the Spanish flu. The flu did not originate in Spain. It originated in the trenches of World War I, first among the Axis troops, and the Germans certainly didn't want it known that their troops were infected with la grippe. Similarly, the Allied forces kept it quiet. The Spanish newspapers, because Spain was a neutral country, had no such compunction about keeping this buried from the world at large, and it circulated widely through the Spanish press and became known as the Spanish flu, not because it originated in Spain, but because it got publicized by Spanish newspapers. Initially, it was thought it was just a variant of one of the age-old varieties of flu. And indeed, once again, our medical officer in health in Toronto thought it was overrated and no more dangerous than the measles, the scarlet fever, or other fevers. However, at the same time as the city of Toronto was turning their mind against it being significant, elsewhere in the province, it was ravaging the cities and towns of rural Ontario, with, in October of 1915, 3,000 cases reported in Brantford itself. Nobody escaped it, whether it was a senior soldier, former commander of the Governor General's body who died from it, the top steeple jockey at the time, or even FDR Roosevelt who caught the flu. It went through all segments of society. Even the Football League, as today, came under threat of extinction. Movie houses were closed, lodge meetings canceled, and as you can see here, it became such an overwhelming problem that even the Boy Scouts of America had to be recruited to assist the nurses and the doctors to provide treatment. And ultimately, it became obvious that it was a very serious and significant disease, going on to express itself with 500 million of dead. The one significant issue was that most of the early deaths and victims of the disease were young people, reflecting what happened with the old age homes of Ontario and the country, where they were packed together, because the same circumstance and culture was happening in the mobilization and demobilization camps of World War I at the end of the war. Like today, masks became the accepted norm in Canada. Here we have the Sisters of the Bon Peuture de Quebec wearing masks during their treatment phase. And the sad part of this story is that one of the nurses from the sisterhood contracted the disease, and the whole of that convent got wiped out, because obviously in those days, personal protective equipment wasn't available. And here we are in Seattle with one of the streetcar conductors saying, "No way, sir, you're getting on this tram." Unlike what we see in America today, where the use of masks has become polarized, there was no such issue facing the American population in 1918, with the Seattle police force out in full uniform and fully masked. Like today, we had to witness public hospitals being set up in soccer fields and recreational parks in New York City. Not much different in the top picture of 1918 from what we saw outside Lenox Hill Hospital and Central Park in New York this past spring. As today, scams came on the scene, reflective a little bit of Donald Trump's decision that perhaps we could swallow a disinfectant, because here is a cure for the flu being made public in Pittsburgh, in which the basis of the serum was creosote. On the other hand, the honest and medical personnel of the time came up with the use of patient serum with its gamma globulins, one of the first instances recognizing the ability to harvest blood from the infected people, spin it down into its component anti-globulin immune components, which was brilliant. Now, we were not immune up here in the Georgian Bay Triangle. The attention paid to the disease in Toronto and other major centers was significant, but the disease certainly didn't limit itself. And Collingwood in October witnessed 40 to 50 cases requiring the schools to close, the churches to close, as well as placements, places of amusement. Doctors on the front line died in Stayner, Flesherton, London, Ontario, and in fact, the year was closed up by the death of a family doctor over in Little Terre in Grey County, the son of the Dr. Oldham family in Chatsworth. So the Spanish flu was a significant issue. It lasted 2.5 years through 1918 into 1920 and beyond. By 1920, it was felt that it shot its bolt and was going to disappear. But here we have, at the end of the year and the start of 1921, Dr. McCrimmon of Kincardine continuing to show the fatal effects of this disease, which is due in the main to pneumococcal pneumonitis and such. The second wave of the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918 and on into 1919 may well hold clues for how to manage the reopening of the economy and cultural centers in North America today. So as an overview, it lasted over 2 years with 3 waves. The major target was the young military, ex-military population. And I'd like to emphasize that no vaccine was ever developed. And you can listen to the hype about vaccine being developed in rapid speed in the United States today, but there's no given that this will prove safe or effective until it's actually on the market. The disease in 1918 on to 1920 ran out of steam and disappeared due to the acquisition of the overwhelming numbers that were infected, giving rise to herd immunity and such. So with that, if you have some questions about the 1918, transmit them to Martin via chat while I take a short little water break, and then we'll resume with part 2 of this talk. Let's now look at what we're facing in the present environment. There has to be distinguishing comments made about the disease versus the virus. The virus is a coronavirus variant of the same family of viruses that gave rise to the SARS epidemic in 1908 and 2008, 2009. And this electron microscopy picture captures the morphology of the virus with great detail. It has a corona around its central nucleus, and that is the source of the derivation of the coronavirus morphin. For those of you that might be interested, the virus in detail has a central nucleus with a nucleic sugar acid as its basis. And I'd like to bring to your attention that the virus is not a living organism, unlike bacteria. It doesn't ventilate, it doesn't circulate blood, it does not eliminate waste, it does not defecate, urinate, and it does not propagate. What does happen is that it replicates inside an unwitting host cell of the host. In this case, the major component of the host environment in the human is pulmonary tissue, but not exclusively. I want to call attention to these little coronavirus spikes. These are very essential to the infective process and to the development of vaccine, because it's these spikes that attach to a cellular body in our pulmonary tract and elsewhere called an ACE2 inhibitor. It's like a piece of Velcro being matched to the spikes that stick it. And once it sticks to the lung cell with this component of the spike, that drills its way in to the tissue and allows egress into the human host of the central nucleus, which is a sugar component. The first known case of coronavirus dates back to last November, although it never really got expressed in great numbers in Wuhan until December of 2019. The first case in the United States, interestingly enough, was on January the 19th in Washington State on the West Coast. And genetic analysis of that particular virus strain showed it was quite different than the strain that attached itself to the East Coast and mainly New York State and the ports of entry from Europe in the later days of March of 2020. The first Canadian case came about a week after the case in Washington. Once again, this one was derived from Wuhan. The patient admitted with respiratory distress to Sunnybrook Hospital. Ultimately, he survived, and his wife, who also became infected, survived. But it wasn't long after before the first death in North America happened in a nursing home in Washington State, and then a week later in a nursing home in Vancouver. And interestingly enough, the source of these fatalities was the variant that came from China to the West Coast and not from the variant that came to the East Coast. On March the 5th, I gave a paper to the PROBUS Club in Collingwood. And that night, my wife and I had made the decision we were not going to fly out west that evening to our annual ski vacation. And that very day, there were 381 cases in the United States. We canceled our flight, and the next day, we decided that we'd go into self-isolation here in Grey County. And within a week, that virus replicated 8 times over, going from 380 cases to almost 3,000 cases. And within 2 weeks, it was at the 40,000 case level. And today we're seeing 40,000 cases, not in 5 days, but on a daily basis. And within 3 weeks of that virus expressing itself, both on the West Coast of the United States and the East Coast of the United States became the country with the most number of COVID-19 cases in the entire world. 4% of its population, but five times the numbers per capita that existed in the Western world, including the Orient. And here we are today on September the 22nd, where the United States, unfortunately, is witnessing a 1/5 of a million people dying since the disease first expressed itself in late January of 2020. And part of this is because of the impossible barrier in the United States of certain segments of society because of public attitude that's become politicized. And here we are at school break and Clearwater Beach in Florida, no masks, no social distancing, carrying on as the world did not have a care. And indeed, when you take a look at one of the people that was interviewed, it tells you why the United States today is facing a crisis of conscience that's going to take a year or two to obliterate, if ever. If I get corona, I get corona, a reveler in Florida said in this widely shared television interview. At the end of the day, I'm not going to let it stop me from partying. And here we are, 6, 8 months later, with that same attitude prevailing. Now let's look and see where we are in the world overall. 31 million infections worldwide, almost 1 million deaths across the world. In the United States, 9 million cases coming up, and as of today, over 200,000 deaths. The only good thing we can say about it is the fatality rate is half that of Canada at 3.1%. Canada has 150,000 deaths staring us in the face by the end of the month, and by the same time we'll have had 10,000 deaths. And for whatever reason, our fatality rate is twice that of the United States, and it's out of keeping with what's the average worldwide. And one of our fellow colonial powers, New Zealand, has got it right. Here we are at the end of last evening, 1,800 cases in the whole country and only 25 deaths. And South Korea, 23,000 cases, only 385 deaths, and a fatality rate of only 1.65% which can be directly attributable to the stance taken through the persuasion of the Vice President of South Korea at the time of the onset of this pandemic, who was a trained epidemiologist and not afraid to bring in sweeping restrictions on mobility and isolation and social distancing. In Ontario today, we've got 47,000 cases staring us in the face, 3,000 deaths, and yesterday, 175 new cases in Toronto alone. And one of the contributors to that is that 67% of today's cases are now generated by people under the age of 40 who do not understand the implications and the obligations required of the social distancing and the covenant that they have, as we elderly people have, with society at large. And we're facing a crisis. Back in May, the Blue Mountains had only 17 cases. And we've been very lucky to have, for 5 months, lived in a bubble with no more cases until there was one generated in Collingwood in the middle of August. And we said, well, maybe that's all there is. But unfortunately, just this past week, there's been a second case in Collingwood under home isolation. And Bruce County likewise had a zero bubble until yesterday. And now in Grey Bruce County, in a case identified through tracing, we now have one case among us. But those cases are basically the exception. Across the province of a whole, we are facing a significant surge and a possibility we're returning to an exponential growth of this virus. If anybody is interested in source reading material, I can't help but recommend two magazines to you available in the library. The first, The Atlantic Monthly, with stories usually by Ed Yong, the lead story being Why the Coronavirus is so confusing, and the second, popular science magazine, Scientific American. This disease was initially felt to target only the lungs and was a respiratory disease, but it exists from brain to toe. It has attacked the kidneys, the heart, the brain, and particularly in the pediatric population, given rise to blue toe syndrome or COVID toes. And this disease is going to leave significant after effects on not only the older population, which seems to be its preferential target at this point in time, probably because of close community living, but in the younger and even the pediatric population. So much for President Trump's statement that the young are immune, having said as recent as last evening that nobody of significance other than the elderly is getting this disease. And so when you take questions from afar and you're isolated from the reality, no wonder your questions seem to be born in the sky. So at the end of that overview of where we are today on the COVID-19 epidemic, and COVID-19 is the term used for the disease. The SARS-2 COVID virus is the name of the virus. So if you have any questions to add to those about section 1, transmit them to Martin via chat while I take a second sip of water. I'm going to preempt some of the questions by putting up a question that probably is on people's minds, and it's related to the flattening of the curve strategy of the mid and late spring of last year. Why did it matter? Well, this was not an approach to curing the disease. It had one fundamental goal in mind, and that was to flatten the curve below the yellow line in order to make sure that our hospital capacity throughout the country and in the province was not overwhelmed by a surge at the time or future surges as may be facing on facing us in coming days. So we achieved this flattening of the curve into an asymmetrical curve. But as you can see, it's nowhere near reducing the disease to nullity, not at all. My prediction is going to move on well into 2021 and perhaps even as far as 2022. The questions that arise that I think you might want to address is it's possible from my viewpoint to collect them under, for the purposes of discussion, of four headings: that of social engineering, herd immunity, antiviral medication, and vaccination. Social engineering, you're all aware of, is simply keep your distance from people and thereby keep your distance from the virus. And everybody now is aware that a cough, a sneeze, singing in a choir, shouting out loud can create aerosol generation up to 6 feet, and indeed, in my view, up to 10 feet from person to person. And so that's why masks matter. More to protect people in your surrounding environment than yourself, but they also do filter some of the viruses out of the air and give you some protection itself. But we know as recent as this week that aerosol spread can also occur well beyond 10 feet. So life's going to be a bit like this: self-isolation, self-discipline, alterations in our social interactions with people. And now you can understand why I've grown the beard and shaved it down today to a little wee thing compared to where I was 3 weeks ago. And this is the coming norm. Paradise after paradise, month after month. An article in the Globe and Mail puts out in pretty stark headlines what we're going to expect in the way of changes to cultural activity and social activity over the next year or two. COVID-19 is changing our lives. It's changing our work. It's changing industrial and personal finances on a permanent basis. All of us have received the $300 check. It really has gone nowhere to ameliorate the financial impact that we've had. I took time out to contact my member of parliament, and I think that helped in a little way to reduce the RIF drawdowns on our RIFs this year for 25%, but it needs all of us to keep in communication with our members of parliament that particular financial item of largesse should be extended until the virus has reached the asymptote of the curve, which is nowhere close. Borders are going to be continued to close. We've seen the Atlantic bubble used successfully to protect the Atlantic provinces from transmission of the disease from coast to coast. People are mobile. People are moving within the country. We may well have a cross-border moratorium, but that has not changed the mobility from place to place. And I suspect that the disease that happened September 17th migrated northwards from the urban centers of Toronto, perhaps Ottawa and Peel County, and the same for the disease that expressed itself yesterday in Grey County. We'll never take vacations of the same nature. Watching movies or rooting for a sports team are clearly changed forever and a day. Now, in the Atlantic this month is a headline that says, the coronavirus isn't going away this winter. In fact, the US outbreak, as we've already, has already started to get worse. So don't pin your hopes on a vaccine. Dr. Fauci is the most believable of the spokesperson in the public health arena in the United States. And as of last night, and quoted in this month's Atlantic, a vaccine is unlikely to be widespread for distribution to ourselves and the older population until well into the 2021 era, third quarter, most likely. Those of us that have comorbidity may see a little break with availability for vaccine application in April, but by and large, even though we're octogenarians for the most part, don't count on vaccination until 2021. And keep in mind, they never did develop a vaccine for the 19 pandemic. And neither did they get a vaccine organized for the SARS outbreak in 2018 or 2008 and 2009. So the Atlantic Monthly guidance says, accept reality, plan for more shutdowns, live like you're going to continue to be contagious and continue to live in a contagious environment. Build your days and your activities and even your living accommodations to be in sync with the pandemic. And pray that there is development, a faster and cheaper methods of quick vaccination identification. And I'd like to interject that the one big challenge and the people that need our support the most are school teachers. The students are returning, but I have a son who's in the teaching profession, and they're not only under the strain of accommodating the change of curriculums to online delivery, but they themselves are doing this while living with the threat of the environment, because not all of our teaching establishments are adequately equipped with ventilation, space, or personal protective equipment. And these are going to be the new heroes of the next several months, if not year or two. Now let me turn to the word herd immunity. Simply put, if you were in a group of 100 people invited to a dance, in which 99 of the people that danced were going to be men and only one woman, and you were a guy going to that dance, and when you got there, you were blindfolded like everybody else, and somebody called out your name and told you to blindly pick a partner. Well, in that environment, your likelihood is 99 chances out of 100 you're going to pick a male, and only one chance in 100 that you're going to pick a female. Well, there you are. If you're male to male in that dancing environment, you've got herd immunity that's going to make sure that there's no unwed mother come out of that evening's entertainment. And that, in a nutshell, is what they mean by herd immunity. And herd immunity, once achieves about 70% of the population, means the virus has no longer witless victims at its behest, and it gradually will go underground. With the SARS virus, that happened quickly because it did not have the same vitality and virality that the SARS-2 virus has. But in order for us to get to herd immunity, which is the basic strategy proposed by Trump's latest medical expert, the neuroradiologist on his panel, is 50 million people in the United States will have to die before they achieve that, and it'll take 4 years to develop herd immunity. So don't cross your fingers that herd immunity is going to solve the problem. Where are we in the field of antiviral medications? Remdesivir was discovered to be effective for the SARS virus, and it does have an ameliorating effect on the hospitalization rate of those that get infected with this disease. But it doesn't cure, it just ameliorates the condition. We have found that dexamethasone, one of the cortisone derivatives, has every bit the same contribution to make. So with the development of remdesivir as an antiviral medication and the use of cortisone and the development of changing respiratory support mechanisms, including have people breathe on their face, the need for virus or for respirators has fallen significantly. In Ontario today, there are 62 patients in the ICUs of the city of Toronto, and only 21 of them require respiratory ventilation support. 3 months ago, that was upwards of 50%. So there is some change on that front, but there's certainly nothing in the way of a cure immediately available. The vaccination is Trump's hope of winning the election, and he's counting on a vaccine to be brought into play before the election. Well, whether it's been proved to be safe and efficacious is basically beyond the point. It's his rescue weapon to re-election. But one of the things that's happened that's making it possible that we may get this vaccine on stream within a year is a new approach taken by the company called Moderna. For those of you who have an interest in genetic chemistry, this is a single strand of sugar, and it's united across those strands by strands of 4 proteins. And that single strand of RNA is not a lot much different in its conical structure than a strand of DNA. And DNA actually has 2 sugar bands, and those 2 sugar bands are united by 4 proteins in different combinations. And all of humankind's chromosomal makeup is made up of a DNA strand with those 4 amino acids. Well, what has happened is Moderna has gone to the crown of the spike and been able to isolate from the crown the RNA messenger molecule that basically gives the crown the chance to infect the ACE2 inhibitor cell in the pulmonary, bowel, or kidney environment. And because they've been able to chemically synthesize that particular chemical strand, they do not have to create a vaccine by injecting the actual virus into their generational host. All they have to do is transmit into it that chemical sequence. This has reduced the risk of disease from development of the virus in the phase 3 human testing field. It doesn't necessarily exclude it completely, as we saw last week from Oxford, where a patient developed spinal inflammation and paresis, but it does enhance the possibility that the viruses coming out of development by this new technique will not only be safe, but as effective, if not more effective, than the usual methods of viral vaccine generation. So this is the company that the world is looking to come up with a vaccine by April for ourselves who have no comorbidities, 3rd or 4th quarter of 2021. We all have ongoing fears: fear of infection, fear of financial collapse, clearly the disruption of family dynamics. I live as an Irishman in the culture of a family that's 4 generations long, and that clearly has been totally disrupted, as has our interplay with friends, fun, and entertainment. But having said all that, I come to the last question thrown out by President Trump, and you can see his question is fired away, has an answer that's totally unhelpful to society at large, and clearly, as far as I'm concerned, criminally negligent in respect to what he's been unable to do for the American population at large. That's his plan in a nutshell, just a scramble of undisciplined mental energy. Well, anyway, that brings me to the end of what I wanted to convey to you today, and I really thank you for your attention. I would like to add one personal comment because I have to say, as I went through the material that gave rise to this talk, I had to come to a personal reckoning that although I'm not a churchy person, I do come from a strong family background of evangelical Presbyterian ministers in the body of my grandfather and my elder brother, both of whom are men of the cloth. And as this project moved forward, and as I say all of this material to you today, I cannot help and remain aloof from the destruction, the dismay, the despair, death, and disillusionment spreading out through society. And this has led me to question my own thin veneer of faith. So I'd like to offer a closing prayer written for me by my brother and from the heart of Reverend Leighton Ford, who visited Collingwood back in the 50s with his wife Jean, Jean Graham of Charlotte, North Carolina. Dear Lord and Father, at the end of our time together, we lift our heart, voices, and hearts to you. We thank you for creating this world for us to flourish in love and peace. We're sorry for the losses that have come through our greed and mistakes, and we ask for grace for those who have suffered because of the COVID-19 epidemic. We offer ourselves to be beacons of hope to the next generation. In your name, God our Father, Christ our healer, Holy Spirit, our guide now and always. Amen. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Bob. If I may segue over to a question and answer session and encourage everybody on this meeting to use the chat facility to type away so we can I can read them out to Dr. Bob to answer. The first question was, should schools be closed now?
I think there's a two-part answer to that. And you have to base this on the work of our public health agencies, both here in the United States. Clearly, one strategy can apply where the rate of infection is at the one person creates one disease, but not beyond that. That allows for identification, tracing, and basically isolation. So those school areas in the province that meet those criteria probably can open up safely. But if there's any chance at all that the communication rate is beyond that parameter, then I think that the schools have to remain closed. And that's a significant challenge for not only the teaching profession and those that are the administrators of our schools today, but it certainly places a big burden on families who have young children going off to school, and particularly children coming from a multi-generational home. One's going to have to err on the side of an abundance of caution, and I think the answer is clear in my mind that if you're part of a multi-generational family with children in the upper age grades, probably grade 6 and onwards, middle school and up, which is an American nomenclature, that they're going to have to move to online education, regardless of the disrupted psychological impact this has on the growing maturation of our adolescent population. Challenging question.
Thank you. Another question also surrounding indoor environment. What are your thoughts about removing a mask if everyone is distanced by 6 feet? That's indoors.
Well, the disturbing thing is the guidance that came out for the American Center for Disease Control yesterday morning, and then was pulled from their website yesterday afternoon, probably because of political interference, because that guidance showed that not only is the bacteria being spread by aerosol spread, droplet spread, but in the indoor environment, the virus can live in air currents without attachment to water vapor droplets from your breathing. That they found that in the environment with choirs, singing, debates, and so on and so forth, there is a significant risk. So if the interior population is spacious, I think it needs a distancing of probably double the 6 foot distance with adequate ventilation. Then yes, I think you're taking a limited risk. But certainly if the indoor environment does not allow spacing, has poor ventilation. I think that there's a serious problem, and we're starting to learn that today when we see, as of yesterday, our caseload in Ontario go from in 3 days, 285 cases up to yesterday, 425 cases. So I think we're on a very significant learning curve that's going to unfortunately clarify these questions by a uptick in infection. The only thing that can be said on the good side of the equation is that 2/3 of those infections are under the age of 40, and the fatality rate in that group is clearly much less than it is in the elderly population, particularly the population with COVID morbidities. But as I said yesterday, a 30-year-old patient with morbid obesity is just as much at risk as a 70-year-old patient with a coexisting condition.
Turning from indoors to outdoors, Louis Charland is asking, should outdoor activities be encouraged by everyone, including our outdoor PROBUS activities?
Well, I'll take Queen's University as an example of where I think things went wrong because of the failure to pre-plan, maybe a failure to recognize the need to pre-plan for activities. My next door neighbor's daughter just went back to Queen's this week in her 2nd year. My other neighbor's daughter went down for her 1st year at Queen's. And the beach outside Queen's University, right opposite Kingston General Hospital, last weekend was filled with bikinis and guys running around showing off their abdominal six-packs, no masks, no social distancing. Clearly an outdoor venue is needed for venting of testosterone and the opposite sex own hormonal needs. And I think that there should have been some attention paid to developing outdoor activity venues, COVID-19 games with shot putting, javelin, et cetera, isolated physical activities that burn up energy, provide for a limited social interaction. But something has to be done to change the psychology of the younger population that we saw inhabiting the beaches way back at spring break in the United States at Clearwater Beach that clearly gave rise to the summer surge. And we're seeing that expressed here with the return to school and particularly the universities, Western University, Queen's University, both have achieved a level of notoriety that I think that they're rather embarrassed about because of what's happened. So I do think that there has to be a chapter added to the page of social engineering that's dedicated specifically to strategies to basically provide controlled physical access to outdoor activities. The one that springs to my mind is the bicycling. Collingwood has the biggest bicycle club in Ontario right now, and that should be a model that all of the communities in the more northern reaches of the province emulate.
Thank you. For me, I'm kind of curious, what is your position on taking vitamin D supplements?
Well, I'll confess that I'm a vitamin C supplement chewer when it comes to a flu bug going through our household or anticipating a plane ride to Vancouver to visit my son's household and their 2 godchildren. But the scientific evidence is pretty sparse that it is scientifically justifiable. I still do it. I'm wedded to it psychologically. I no longer can provide a convincing scientific evidence that it works. And I think the same holds true of zinc, vitamin T, which sit on our shelf. My wife's a little bit on the user side of things. Myself, I think it's speculative at best.
Okay.
It's maybe a little better than taking chlor and creosote, but how much better, I'm not prepared to say. But
Wonderful. Well, thank you. That is the list of questions we have.
for a second, because there's a lot of what we don't know about the psychology of immunology. And that may well be what we're looking at here. Not molecular biology, but the psychology. And by that, I'll take a page out of medical pages for women's health. You take a woman with breast cancer and put her into a solitary treatment protocol, and take a equivalent lady with the same disease classification and put her into a cohort of 10 other women with a like disease, and then treat them both with the same surgical discipline, radiation, and chemotherapy support with tamoxifen. And you'll find in that cohort, when you compare them, that the cohort of those that were treated in a group setting is significantly improved over the patient that is allowed to grieve and to go into somewhat social isolation. And the only explanation is that the psychological benefits of being treated in a support group where you have the benefit of believing that you're on the winning ticket and not on the losing ticket, in and of and by itself, is a very, very important parameter of treatment of that particular disease and other diseases that are now becoming recognized as being needful of profound psychological support throughout the treatment, and particularly in the post-treatment rehabilitation phase. So from that point of view, if there are people that believe in vitamin D and zinc, and perhaps even myself with vitamin C, there are benefits that are hard to define, but are clearly there when looked for by different scientific methodologies that are now just starting to bear fruit in the medical research literature.
Wonderful. Thank you. And if I can.
Yes.
Okay.
I'd like to present Dr. Bob with this honorarium. And thank you for this interesting, informative presentation. Wow. It really opens your eyes to how we should react during this pandemic. Thank you so much.
I really appreciate that, Anne. And I just want to say for the audience that Anne and I have a lot in common. Both of us are Toronto General Hospital grads, myself in medicine and orthopedics, and Anne as a student nurse who was a classmate of one of my classmates, Barb Green Schutz. In fact, Hart was instrumental in my getting successful neurosurgical management of my wife's own medical condition. But over and above that, not only were we at the Toronto General Hospital together, we both shared time at the Royal Vic Hospital in Montreal and Pine Street as well. So it's a small world.
Small world.
And for that, I thank you, Anne. And thank your audience for their attention. And I hope I gave them a little bit of food to chew on.
A fabulous presentation. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, I'm going to leave you to your own question and answer session. And in closing, Martin, thank you very much for your technical support. We couldn't have done this online Zoom session without you.
Wonderful. It was quite the experience.
And can we all give a hand to our speaker?
All right.
Thank you. Bravo.
Okay, bye then.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.